You want to quote the nurse to me? After 7 years of daughters.
What you give me is what I bring out. The nurse said it. Science says it. It is the truth.
The truth? I am warning you. Stop talking.
I have been quiet for 7 years, David. Not today.
I said stop!
The gender comes from the man, from your sperm, not from my body. You have been blaming me for something you...
Get out! Get out of this!
My babies, David, Ned, my babies! Chai, he pushed her. He pushed a woman with newborns onto the road. Somebody help her now.
You brought this on yourself. You brought all of it on yourself.
David, please, don't leave us.
Grace hit the wet road with her left shoulder and curled her body around the twins before she even understood what she was doing. It was not a decision. It was something older than thought. Something that lives in the bones of every mother and moves faster than pain, faster than shock, faster than the cold Lagos rain that was already soaking through her hospital gown and flooding the surgical wound she had been told not to strain for at least 6 weeks. She curved herself around those 2-3-day-old girls and she made her flesh a wall between them and the ground, and she stayed there while the white Camry's tail light dissolved into the rain and the traffic and the dark. People were shouting. A woman in a soaked Ankara wrapper had already reached her. Hands came from every direction. Strangers first, then more people, then a man who recognized her from her mother's church and made a phone call that would change everything that followed. Grace heard the voices above her.
He pushed her.
The way you...
Those are newborn babies. Somebody call an ambulance. She said nothing. She ran her fingers over each small head, each small back, each tiny heartbeat, alive, frightened, unharmed. And something that had been wound tightly inside her chest for 7 years began quietly to release. Not from relief alone, from decision. She had married David Okonkwo in Enugu at 24, and she had loved him the way young women love men who have not yet shown them everything they are. He had been warm in those early days, attentive. He remembered which side of the bed she preferred and that she was afraid of heavy rain and that she took her tea without sugar. His mother had held Grace's hands at the wedding and called her a gift. His father had told David in front of the whole family to carry this woman carefully. She is gold. And Grace had stood in her white lace believing with her whole open heart that she was walking into the rest of her life. The first daughter, Adaze, arrived 11 months into the marriage. David smiled at the hospital, but the smile was thin, the kind that lives only on the mouth and goes no further. Grace told herself she was tired and imagining things. New mothers imagine. Their second daughter, Sandra, came 2 years later, and David sat in the plastic hospital chair and stared at the floor and said, "We will try again." Not, "She is healthy." Not, "She is beautiful." "We will try again." Grace held Sandra against her chest and nodded and filed those 4 words away in a place she had begun to fill with things she could not yet name. By the time their third daughter, Michelle, was born, the house in Lekki had changed in ways that were difficult to describe but impossible to live inside without feeling. David came home later every evening. He spoke to Grace the way a man speaks to a situation he has decided to endure. His mother began visiting in the afternoons and sitting in Grace's kitchen with her tea and her careful voice that was designed to wound without leaving marks. She said things like, "The women in our family always give sons." She said, "Perhaps you should pray more. Visit a pastor. See someone who knows these things." Grace would pour the tea with steady hands and excuse herself to the sewing room she had built in the back of the house and sit alone until the feeling of being slowly erased passed enough for her to breathe. She had built that sewing room herself, not David.
Grace had started her tailoring business 3 years into the marriage with 20,000 naira borrowed from her younger sister and repaid in 4 months. She sewed school uniforms and burial outfits and occasion dresses and asoebi sets, and she saved every naira she earned into an account that had only her name on it, because something deep and quiet and watchful inside her understood before her mind caught up that she was going to need it. She did not examine that understanding too closely. She simply obeyed it. She saved and she sold and she smiled at David's mother's tea. Visits, and she kept going. When the twins were conceived, she sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time after seeing the result. Then she stood up and made breakfast for her 3 daughters and packed their school bags and walked them to the gate and came back inside and sat down at her sewing machine and did not stop working until midnight. She did not cry. Crying would not change the biology, and she knew the biology now, had known it for 2 years since the specialist in Victoria Island had told her plainly in that clean white office with diplomas on the wall that the gender of every child is determined by the father's sperm, that a woman carries 2 X chromosomes and can only pass X, that the man carries X and Y, and it is his contribution alone that decides. She had held that knowledge like a stone in her pocket. She had not thrown it, not yet. She threw it in the car. She should not have. She knew that even as the words were forming, knew that David was already beyond the place where facts could land, deep inside that particular anger that does not want the truth, only wants agreement with its own wrong story. But 31 hours without sleep and a fresh caesarean wound and 7 years of absorbing blame in silence had burned through every careful calculation she had ever made, and what came out of her was plain, clean, and exactly 3 seconds too honest. That was when he pushed her out of the moving car onto the wet Lagos road in the rain with both newborn twins in her arms. She was rushed back to Lagos Island General Hospital within 20 minutes. Same ward, same smell of antiseptic and fluorescent light, but a different Grace arrived this time. A Grace who had left something on that road behind her, something she would never pick back up. Nurse Philippa was still on duty. She said nothing beyond what was medically necessary. She checked the wound. She checked both twins with the methodical care of a woman who had spent 22 years making sure babies survived the things adults did to each other. She stood beside Grace's bed while the doctor worked, and she did not once say, "I told you so," because she was a professional, and professionals do not say such things. But before she left the room, she paused at the door and looked at Grace with the steady eyes of a woman who has seen this particular story many times and knows exactly how it must end. "Your family is coming," she said. "Rest now. You will need your strength for what comes next." Kenneth arrived first, Grace's brother, 31. Years old, quiet, printing company in Surulere, the kind of man who speaks rarely but means every word. He stood in the doorway of the room and looked at his sister in the bed and the twins in the cot beside her, and his face moved through several things very quickly before it settled into something still and decided. He made 3 phone calls, short ones. Then he sat in the chair beside Grace's bed and said nothing and stayed there all night without moving. Their parents arrived from Enugu the next morning. Grace's mother went directly to the bed and took her daughter's hand and held it without speaking for a long time. Grace's father stood at the window with his back to the room and looked out at the Lagos morning with the face of a man who is measuring something. Then he turned around and said quietly to Kenneth, "Arrange the vehicle. We are taking her home. Not to David's house, to Enugu,
to the red-roofed house where Grace had grown up, the compound with the mango tree and her mother's cooking moving through every room, and the particular smell of home that never fully leaves you no matter how many years pass. She was carried in carefully. Her old room was prepared. A cot was brought for the twins. Her sisters came that evening. Her aunties came the day after. The house filled with the warmth of women who have decided together that one of their own will not be destroyed. And that decision has weight and permanence that no man's anger can match. Grace lay in her childhood bed and looked at the ceiling she had stared at as a girl and felt not peace yet, no, it was too soon for peace, but something close to solid ground under her. The twins slept on either side of her, small, warm, breathing weights, and she watched them in the dark and felt the decision that had begun forming on that wet Lagos road continue to harden inside her into something permanent. She was not going back. David came to the Enugu house 11 days later. He came in the late afternoon when the light was low and golden and the compound was quiet. He was thinner. His kaftan was clean, but he had not ironed it properly. And there was something around his eyes, a hollowness that had not been there before. He knocked at the gate and Kenneth opened it and looked at him the way you look at something you have already decided about. David said he wanted to see his wife. Kenneth said nothing. He stepped back from the gate and called into the compound, and within 4 minutes, there were 6 people standing in that yard. Grace's father, her 2 brothers, her uncle who drove 3 hours from Onitsha when he heard what happened, and 2 neighbors who had known Grace since she was a child and had come specifically for this moment. They stood in a semicircle and they looked at David, and nobody raised a hand, and nobody needed to, because the weight of those 6 pairs of eyes was already more than David had prepared himself to carry. Grace's father spoke first. He was 63 years old and worked as a civil engineer for 30 years, and he had a voice that carried the particular authority of a man who has built things and knows the difference between a solid structure and one that will not hold. He said, "You pushed my daughter out of a moving vehicle 3 days after surgery with her newborn children in her arms, in the rain." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. David opened his mouth. Grace's father said, "I am not asking you a question. I am telling you what you did so that you hear it said clearly by someone who loves her." David said he was sorry. He said he had been under pressure. He said his family had been on him about his son, and he had lost his mind for a moment, and he was deeply sorry, and he wanted to make it right. Kenneth said, "You want to make it right?" David said yes. He said he was ready to change. He said Grace was his wife and the mother of his children, and he needed her to come home. Kenneth took one step forward. Grace's uncle put a hand on Kenneth's shoulder, not to stop him, just to say, "Not yet, let it breathe." Grace's father said, "Go back to Lagos, David. Go back and sit in that house and think very carefully about what a man who throws his wife and newborn babies onto a Lagos road in the rain deserves to receive from her. Take as much time as you need. There is no rush." David stood there for a moment longer, looking at these men, looking at the compound,
looking toward the house where he could not see Grace, but could perhaps feel the fact of her, solid, present, no longer available to him in the way he had always assumed she would be. Then he turned, and he walked back to his car, and he drove away. Inside the house, Grace was sitting in the parlor with both twins on her lap when her father came back in. He sat across from her. He looked at her for a long moment. "He came," he said. "I know," Grace said. "He wants you back." Grace looked down at the twins. The one on the left, who had already developed the habit of curling her fingers around whatever she could reach, had wrapped her tiny hand around Grace's thumb and was holding it with the full determination of someone who has decided not to let go. Grace looked up at her father. "I know what I'm worth now. It took me 7 years and a Lagos road in the rain to learn it, but I know it."
Her father nodded slowly. He said nothing else. He did not need to. 3 months later, Grace reopened her tailoring business, not from David's house in Lekki, but from a proper shop in Enugu. A single room at first, with 2 industrial machines and a sign above the door that her brother Kenneth painted himself. She named it after her daughters, all 5 of them. The name took up the whole sign, and she liked it that way. David called 17 times in the first 2 months. She did not block his number. She simply did not answer. There is a particular kind of power in that, in letting a phone ring and choosing your silence the way you once chose your words, with full awareness of what it costs the other person to hear nothing. He came back to Enugu once more. This time, her uncle turned him away at the gate before he even knocked. He heard from her sister that David's mother had fallen ill shortly after, that the business he ran in Lagos, a logistics company he had started with a partner, had hit trouble when the partner withdrew over a dispute, that David was living in the Lekki house alone now, cooking for himself, telling people his wife was visiting family and would return soon. She did not return. What returned instead was Grace herself, the version of her that had existed before 7 years of blame and carefully worded kitchen visits had pressed her smaller and smaller. She woke early and worked late, and her daughters grew loud and strong in their grandparents' compound, and the shop expanded within 6 months from 1 room to 3. She hired 2 apprentices, then 4. Then she was training women from across the street and from 2 compounds down and from a church she had joined when nobody knew her as David Okonkwo's wife. They knew her as Grace, the one who makes the beautiful things, the one whose hands do not shake. The twins took their first steps on the same afternoon, the one on the left going first by about 40 seconds, which surprised nobody who had been watching her. Grace was in the shop when her mother called her from the yard, and she dropped everything and ran and stood in the compound doorway and watched her daughters walk toward her across the red earth with their arms out for balance and their faces wide open with the shock and delight of discovering what they could do. She did not think about David in that moment. She thought about nothing except what was directly in front of her. 2 small, upright humans walking toward her across the ground she had built under their feet by surviving what she survived. And she opened her arms and they fell into them. And she held all 5 daughters in the compound that afternoon. The older 3 home from school and crowding around the twins, everyone talking at once, and Grace sat in the middle of all that noise and all that life and felt, finally, completely, without reservation, that she had won. Not a prize, not a competition, something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. She had won herself back, and that was the only victory that had ever mattered. David heard about the shop, about the apprentices, about the sign with all 5 daughters' names. Someone who knew someone told him,
and he sat in his Lekki house alone on a Tuesday evening and looked at the wall and understood fully, finally, in his body and not just his mind, exactly what he had thrown out of a moving car on a rainy Lagos road. He understood it the way you understand certain things only when it is far too late to do anything about them. That was his consequence. Not a confrontation, not a public shaming, just the long, private, daily weight of knowing, of waking up every morning in a house that used to have life in it and sitting with the absolute silence of all he chose to destroy. Karma does not always arrive loud. Sometimes it moves in quietly and sits down and stays. Now tell me, was it her fault for speaking the truth, or was David wrong from the beginning? Drop your answer in the comments. We want to hear from you.
If this story touched you, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs it today. And drop a comment. We want to hear from you. God bless you.